Gideon. The story. Joshua's prophecy concerning the Israelites turning from God and his commands came true. The generation that Joshua led across the Jordan River stayed faithful to God even after Joshua passed on, continuing until the elders under Joshua passed on too. But that generation's children reverted to the ways of their grandparents, fulfilling Joshua's prophecy concerning the Israelites turning from God and his commands. However, God did not abandon his people, despite them worshipping the gods of the surrounding nations, raising up many judges, the name given to those who ruled over the Israelites between Joshua's death and the crowning of King Saul. These judges kept the Israelite people in line with the 613 laws received from God through Moses many decades before. The Israelites achieved many military victories under these judges, claiming more of the promised land that Joshua couldn't complete during his time, yet failing to claim parts when the Israelites returned to their idolatry. These judges include Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, and the great prophetess Deborah. The Israelites rebelled against God 40 years after Deborah's triumph in Canaan and reign ended, and Israel was harassed by the Midianites, Amalekites, and the other Bedouin peoples for 7 years. Yet God didn't desert his people, commissioning a young man from the tribe of Manasseh, Gideon, the son of Joshua, the Abarite. Gideon was at his family home in Ophrah, beating out some wheat in his family's winepress to save the grain from being seized by the Midianites. The angel of the Lord, who was sitting under a nearby oak tree on the property, approached him, commanding Gideon to free the Israelites from the Midianites, Amalekites, and the other Bedouin people in their land, and condemned his fellow Israelites for their continued idolatry. Gideon didn't know this was the angel of the Lord and was suspicious, not believing this message was from God, but still asked for a sign and produced an offering for him. The offer consisted of a pot of broth, the meat of a young goat placed in a basket, and unleavened bread made from an ephah, 13 kgs of flour. The angel of the Lord saw Gideon's distrust and decided to show Gideon a sign. He instructed Gideon to lay the meat and bread on a rock nearby and pour out the broth, after which the angel of the Lord touched each item with his staff, and they were consumed with fire. Then he disappeared in front of Gideon. God reassured him as he feared this encounter, realizing it was the angel of the Lord. Calmed, Gideon built an altar to thank God for this sign. During this same night, God commissioned Gideon to take his father's bull and another bull, this one 7 years old, and destroy his father's altar to Baal and his Asherah, a wooden symbol of a female deity, and construct an altar to God in its place. God commanded Gideon to sacrifice the second bull on the altar and use the wood from the Asherah. Like before, Gideon was nervous and suspicious, so he took 10 men from his father's house and completed God's mission by night. The men of the city awoke the following morning to find the altar to God and the one to Baal and their Asherah gone, yet they had no clue who did it. However, after some investigation, discovered the culprit was Gideon and confronted his father Joshua, demanding he allow them to put his son to death for his actions. But Joshua refused, stating if Baal was a god, he would deal with it himself. While this was happening, all the Midianites, Elamites, and the sons of the east had assembled themselves and camped in the valley of Jezreel. God informed Gideon about this through his spirit. Gideon blew the war trumpet, and the Baalite Abiezrites, knowing it was serious, joined him, along with the rest of East Manasseh and the surrounding regions of Asher, Naphtali, and Zebulun. Even with the fire sign, Gideon asked God for another sign to prove he was with him and the Israelites. This time Gideon placed a fleece of wool on the threshing floor, requesting God only let the fleece be filled with dew and leave the area surrounding it dry. The next morning the ground was dry, and Gideon squeezed a bowl of dew from the fleece. Yet Gideon wasn't convinced, requesting God complete the sign again, but reversed: dry fleece, wet ground. God did exactly as Gideon asked. This third and final sign convinced Gideon. He and the battle-ready men left and camped in the spring of Harod, south of Midian's base. However, God wasn't happy about the number of troops Gideon brought, so Gideon cut the 32,000 to 10,000. God still wasn't pleased, so Gideon cut them down even more, leaving 300, which satisfied God. These 300 men took provisions and trumpets, and on this same night God spoke to Gideon confirming their victory and allowed Gideon to bring his servant Purah if he wanted. So Gideon left with Purah to the camp where their enemies were stationed. When they arrived, Gideon overheard one recalling a dream he had. Gideon understood the dream was concerning the Israelites' upcoming conflict with the Midianites, Amalekites, and the sons of the east, the other two peoples joining while the Midianites were camped out. The man he was speaking with interpreted the dream to confirm a victory for Gideon and the Israelites. On hearing this, Gideon bowed before God and thanked him for this blessing. Gideon returned to the Israelites' camp and separated the 300 men into 3 groups, giving each man a trumpet and a pitcher with a torch inside it. Gideon commanded the men to follow his lead and blow their trumpet immediately after he did, and shout, "For the Lord and for Gideon." This is how God was going to deliver his people. Gideon and one of the groups stationed themselves on the outskirts of their enemy's camp, with the other 2 groups following suit. On Gideon's command, the Israelites blew their trumpets and announced their war cry. Then each smashed the jar hiding the torch and waved the torch around to trick the Midianites, Amalekites, and the sons of the east into believing the Israelite troops were of greater number than the 300 present. The trick worked, and Gideon called for the Ephraimites to pursue the retreating Midianites and their princes Oreb and Zeb, who caught and killed the 2 leaders, cutting off their heads and bringing them to Gideon. Gideon and his 300 chased the Midianites' kings Zebah and Zalmunna, following them over the Jordan River. Gideon and the 300 inquired of the people of Succoth and Peniel about supplies for their mission, but they refused to help and insulted them in return. Gideon vowed to punish both cities for their actions, thrashing the elders and men of Succoth with thorns and briars, and pulled down the tower of Peniel, killing all men there. Gideon and the 300 caught and captured Zebah and Zalmunna, and Gideon invited his eldest son Jephthah to have the honour of slaughtering the 2, but he was young and too nervous and scared to accept. The 2 kings mocked Gideon for being too cowardly to do it himself, yet Gideon proved them wrong by slaying them and taking their crescent ornaments around their camel's neck. After defeating their enemies, the Israelites decided they wanted Gideon as king, but he denied their request, saying God was their king. He did, however, reign as Israel's judge for 40 years, from the fireside at his family home till his death. Gideon had 70 children through many wives, plus Abimelech, who would succeed him as Israel's new judge when Gideon passed, with a Shechemite concubine. Yet despite remaining faithful to God throughout his journey, Gideon made an ephod, a ceremonial garment worn by the high priest, from 1,700 shekels, 71 pounds or 19.6 kgs of gold from earrings acquired from the spoil, the crescent ornaments from the camels' necks and the kings of Midian, along with the king's pendants and their purple robes, which eventually after Gideon's death caused Israel to sin and turn completely from God, and destroyed Gideon's family's reputation within Israel. This didn't help things, as Israel also worshipped the false god Baal Berith after Gideon's death, forgetting what Gideon and God had done. Digging deeper. We'll start by investigating Gideon's calling. Some have compared this encounter between Gideon and the angel of the Lord to Abraham and God's interaction in Genesis 18. In both, the divine visitor arrives unexpectedly. In both, the visitor make an offering, Gideon's goat unleavened bread and broth, Abraham's young calf bread cakes in a form of yogurt. Both were commissioned with tasks and doubted God's ability to fulfill it. There are some differences between the 2. The feasts are different. The visitors didn't eat the offering with fire in Abraham's story, and Abraham didn't ask God for a sign. These 2 stories could be similar because both are unlikely candidates for the missions God put them on. A young nervous man to lead and defeat Israel's enemies, a 100-year-old man and his 90-year-old wife to have a child that would become Israel. We'll carry on by looking at the process God commands Gideon to perform to cut his army from 32,000 men down to 300 men. The first method used to downgrade was simple. God commanded Gideon to relieve men too scared to fight, cutting it down to 10,000 men. God may have decided this method because the fearful fighters could turn from his commands and cause Israel to lose their battles. The last is more complicated. God instructed Gideon to lead the men to the water, and the ones who lapped the water on their knees like dogs were dismissed, while those who drank by putting their hand to their mouth were chosen, cutting it down to the final 300 men. Yet some have said those who drank like dogs stayed, and those who drank with their hands left. Which is it? To be safe, we'll look at both. The drink like dogs could have been chosen because their knelt hunch-over position could be seen as submission and vulnerability, loyalty towards God. However, Isaiah 56:10, Luke 16:21, and Philippians 3:2 mention dogs negatively, making it offensive to God, but also positively in other parts. So it's unclear. The drink with hands group's position when drinking the water could make them alert and sneaky, since they could hide the water, proving they could handle the stealth mission God had planned. Yet might have been rejected because they appeared less submissive and could rebel against God and his plan. Still, since some translations state dogs chosen and others hands chosen, it's unclear which is right. We'll finish this section by looking at the legacy left by Gideon. The first is the American organisation founded in 1899, Gideon's International, which distributes free Bibles. You probably have one. Their logo is the two-handed picture Gideon and the Israelites used in their attack on the Midianites. It seems they chose Gideon as their namesake because of his faithfulness to God. It also could be because many of their Bibles are pocket-sized, representing the small 300-man army Gideon took to battle. Another very interesting point is that in 2021, at the Kirbet el-Rai dig site in central Israel, a fragment of pottery with a partial inscription written in brown ink, saying Jerubbaal, another name for Gideon. It has been dated to around 1100 BC, which according to many biblical scholars lines up with when the biblical Gideon lived, potential proof of the Bible's historical truth. What to learn? What should we take away from Gideon's story in Judges 6-8? I believe it teaches us the importance of trusting God. Gideon is fondly remembered as a faithful follower and witness of God, as seen in Hebrews 11:32. Yet Gideon wasn't always perfect, and his relationship with God was shaky at the beginning and end. When God first commissioned and appointed Gideon as Israel's judge, he didn't believe this was God and asked for 3 signs, the fire sign and later the 2 fleece signs, when Gideon and the Israelites were preparing for battle. Although there's nothing wrong with confirming it's God speaking and not a demon, asking for 3 signs may seem excessive to some. Yet after each time, Gideon trusted God and followed his commands perfectly when comfortable he was speaking with him. How does this apply to us today? Despite his reluctance, Gideon is a fantastic example of faith and loyalty to God for us to follow. Still, we could see Gideon's reluctance as caution, testing the spirits like John says in 1 John 4, something we should always do. When you believe God is the one speaking, act on what he commands like Gideon did and fulfill the plans God has for your life.